This is Monica Perez. Sorry about that little false start. This is Monica Perez here with Domenic Scarcella. He's an author, he's a teacher, he's a podcaster. And for me, I just think he's an interesting person with deep thoughts and a lot of knowledge on some of the topics that I'm interested in, particularly Catholicism, but also culture, the state, stuff we all like to talk about in this crowd. So thank you, Domenic, for being here.
Thank you for that kind intro, Monica. Good to meet you in person after connecting through messaging and emailing.
Yes, and I first heard you on Scott and William's show. You were talking about Rene Girard, whom I just hadn't really known anything about until I started investigating J.D. Vance and his connection to Peter Thiel and their whole Girard thing. And then I found that the archetype of the scapegoat and the victim god and everything was rang true in many respects. And then also I felt like maybe felt short in some respects. I don't want to get ahead of myself. I will just blurt out all the thoughts I had when I was listening to your conversation. But first, I want to know a little bit about you, about you don't have to actually tell us your day job, but what's your trade or training? Like, where is your educational background, and why what makes you interested in writing, thinking, teaching, sharing this stuff, and what maybe what your goal is?
Many people have heard the old phrase, "Jack of all trades, master of none." That's me. The full couplet, though, is "Jack of all trades, master of none, though oftentimes better than master of one." So I enjoy being a generalist. I actually like it. Yeah. It's not putting down people who branch out. It's actually celebrating that some people do that and have to. I've worked in publishing, in news media. I've worked in broadcast operations, behind the scenes, in engineering and operations. I've done freelance stuff. I've been an indie musician and a performer, a pro wrestling commentator for an indie promotion in southern New Jersey, where I currently live. I've worked in software briefly. And then sometime last year, almost exactly a year ago, I published a short book. And then very quickly after that, launched a Substack where I've managed to write weekly and surprised myself that I have ideas each week to write about, because I'm not much of an idea person. You mentioned one of them, Rene Girard. I've written 3 articles on Rene Girard. It was our friends Scott and William who suggested some of Girard's work to me. Other people had also mentioned Girard in light of what some of my writings were. And so, one of the ways I get ideas is people say, "Hey, do you find this interesting?" I say, "Well, let me look into it." And here I
love
am.
that.
I'm currently looking for something full-time. I'm doing part-time things. You mentioned teaching. I do teach it at my parish church. Yeah, and I'm an over-talker.
So I was counting on that, actually. I thought, because it is early for me. And I thought, so how crafted do I have? How many questions do I have to make the questions flow? And I said, oh, he's a talker. He's gonna take it away. All I have to do is throw an idea out there, and we'll get your thoughts. And I love them. So here's your book, Good Neighbor, Bad Citizen. Why don't you give us I don't know if an overview or a synopsis or what your point was, whatever you want to tell us about that book. But I do suggest that it's the kind of thing, it's very short. It covers the Stations of the Cross. The holiday season is coming. I highly recommend. I'm going to actually buy a hard copy. You sent me the PDF, and I did buy the Kindle edition as well. And you're welcome. And then, but to have something like that to reflect, to take with you during the, I like to, my church does the Stations of the Cross on Fridays, and I would like a little more, get a little deeper. So that does that. But tell us about the book and, what your purpose is.
About a year ago, I wanted to learn the online on-demand publishing platforms. And I started to look into things like Amazon and Lulu. And at some point I realized this would be a lot easier if I had a book.
Yes.
There's only so much you can do by just reading and saying, oh, if I had a book, I would press this button. And then
exactly.
So I said, well, what can I write about? And I prayed the Stations of the Cross, and I'm interested in the history, the culture, and the context of the Gospels. I always tell people you're much better off learning to understand history, culture, and context than to be able to quote book, chapter, and verse. So understand the real history that took place, and who the people are, and what the cultural references are. And about a year earlier, I had been teaching OCIA, which is for adults who are curious about the church. And at some point, you always get to the chapter on citizenship and dealing with the civil world. And one of the students asked, so we have to be good citizens, right? And I said, well, be careful about that.
Yeah.
Jesus wants us to be good neighbors, but was Jesus a good citizen? How about the apostles? Look at what happened to them. Look at really what happened to the early church. And so that was really the first time I had crystallized the phrase good neighbor, bad citizen. And then a little while later, I said, I'm going to write a book, Good Neighbor, Bad Citizen, on the Stations of the Cross. And as I started writing it, I kept in mind 64 pages, 64 pages, 64 pages. Because if you don't get above 60 pages, Amazon or Lulu, Barnes and Noble, one of them would not put a spine on the book. So I had to make it long enough to get a spine.
Oh, funny.
Rather than just stapling it down the middle.
Yeah. And is it written on the spine?
Pardon?
Is it written on the spine? Does it
No,
show?
it's not a large enough spine to get any text on it, but it is a spine.
Very good.
So I wrote something long enough to be, it's supposed to be a meditative aid, in the sense that you could, if you wanted to learn about a devotional to it, you use it for meditation. You could do it. The hard copy, each station starts on the left-hand page and finishes on the right-hand page. So it's completely self-contained. Nice. And as you turn the page, you're on a new station. Nice. And every
that'll be good if you actually
three starts on its own right-hand page there. Yeah. So it's set up to be a hard copy book, although you can use the Kindle edition or the Nook if you like Barnes and Noble. But it's set up to be a meditative aid that you could perhaps take with you and do a Stations of the Cross devotional with it. I try to be quite cognizant of the history and the cultural references. And there are a lot of things I write in the book that referring to history and culture that perhaps modern Christians haven't heard, especially in the West. Mm-hmm. And so it could be a controversial book in that regard. But hey, Jesus was controversial. The subtitle for the book is Reflections on the Core Social Conflict Revealed by Jesus Christ's Way of the Cross. So it's all about the controversy and of being a good neighbor. You would think, well, aren't good neighbors just the nicest people? Not always. Nice is someone else's comfortable opinion of you. Good neighborliness is not necessarily nice. It's kind, but it's not necessarily nice.
That's a lot. Like just the subtitle, the core social conflict revealed by Jesus Christ's way of the cross. The core social conflict is that he was a good neighbor and a bad citizen. That was your conception? I mean, that's bold. That's and I had
it's bold in the modern West. It's not bold for the early church. But it's not bold for the gospel writers.
To claim to have identified the core social conflict. Mm-hmm. I think,
it's right there, right in the Gospels. It's right there in the history. He's constantly running afoul of civil authorities who are going by sort of the old social order status structure. It's hierarchical and it's imposed. That's the big thing. It's imposed. It's the way chimpanzees organize their tribes, for crying out loud. It's left over from deep evolution. This is how people organize. Might makes right.
I had a thought, and I've never learned this, and I don't have the confidence to say that I could be right about something that's original in the realm of religion or Catholicism or Jesus or any of that. Is that I thought the most significant takeaway or lesson that Jesus imparted was to do away with the in-group, out-group thing. Like the Good Samaritan parable to me is like the most important thing. It's just the crux of it. But I almost feel like that's a core social conflict. That's a core social concept anyway.
Sure. Well, the idea of in-group, out-group, we all have in-groups because we're simply social creatures, but we're not friends with everybody on the planet.
Right.
So there's always going to be people you're familiar with. Researchers have discovered that I think it's called the Dunbar number. You can
like
socialize
150.
closely. Yeah, it's about 150.
Yeah,
So
I think that's
what an
true. That's
old
how many
tribe would
Christmas
be.
cards I send out.
There you go, right? You are right at the Dunbar limits.
Yeah.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
impressive. So we all form in groups. The problems, what do you do with people who are not in your in group? And if you use the firm out group designation for people, yeah, you run afoul. That's ancient tribalism, but that's not what Jesus wants to do. And if you impose that on people, might makes right style, then that's really, really contrary to what Jesus is. Now you're talking about what I would call citizenship, which is your place in the imposed hierarchical social order. So yes, so Jesus is maybe instead of in group, out group, it's in group and not yet group, or in group and maybe again group.
Well, I think for me, what's the critical difference is the double ethic. It's okay to have an in group and an out group, and it's okay to be more comfortable with people whose values that you are confident are consistent with yours, because you want to promote the productivity of people who are pursuing the same goals as you. So in my church, every church I've ever been to, really, because I grew up in Rockland County and we used to go to the church in Spring Valley, which was Haitian and now it's Filipino, but we would never go to the church that was near us. My parents didn't like the whole blue hair thing, and they would go to where they could help and stuff. I mean, we were totally poor anyway, so maybe they just didn't like the the demands of the nicer church. But I always noticed that there were all different races and economic classes, and basically certainly no discrimination, but even prejudice wasn't really there. And it was funny. My mother used to say, Jean, my black friend Jean. I'm like, first of all, Mom, you only have one friend named Jean. You don't have to say that. But, they love them. And I feel like it was the basis of that is that we all had the exact same values and goals. And so promoting and helping each other, you could trust that your efforts on their behalf would be used wisely. And you wanted them to succeed because you believed they did good work. Like Jean wanted to go join Mother Teresa's order.
Oh, wow.
He didn't, because it was too hard. He went and came back because it was too hard. He said it was just too hard. But anyway, so there's that. Like, I understand the value actually of the in-group, but when you have a double ethic, that's when, and I think this is still the dominant style in the world even today, the double ethic being you treat people in the in-group better than you treat people in the out group. You give them a better price, you give them a better deal, you're more honest, it's a fair trade. Or you can take it to the secret society level, the Masons or the Skull and Bones, where they actually give jobs and stuff to people who are in their in-group, even if they don't own the company. If you own the company, you can do whatever you want, as far as I'm concerned. But if you don't own the company, if you're just a boss and they have a non-discrimination policy and you're like, oh, the secret handshake, give this guy the job, that's a double ethic. And to me, that's like profoundly immoral. But it's so dangerous to live in a world where you don't do that, but everybody else does do that. Because I mean, it makes me think Christianity is at a serious disadvantage because of that.
The question is of the double ethic is really the question of dignity and violence, not necessarily the distinction between you're more confident around some people who you've gotten to know already. I mean, friendship is very important in Christianity. Friendship is an affection brought about by shared experiences. So it relies on actually encountering a person and engaging with them. And I don't think anything wrong with developing that level of confidence in other people, where some people you would be more apt to trust with a particular set of tasks, or you wouldn't just let anybody babysit your kids,
right?
So as long as the distinctions we make don't get into violence and really a set of double standards for people, then I think that's really the dividing line for the Christian ethic is, do you hold to human dignity in how you treat people? Not do you give everybody favors equally, but do you hold to human
Right.
dignity, or
Yes.
do you
Yes.
are you willing to make excuses to violate human dignity?
Yeah.
The big problem with citizenship and with governments is that it's inherently violent. I mean, government by definition is a monopoly violence institution. It claims a monopoly on violence within a particular territory. It's a coercive civil authority. It's not just a hierarchy of values or a hierarchy of competence or even a hierarchy of proprietorship. It's a hierarchy of imposing on people in ways that violate natural human rights. And that's where the problem comes in. Jesus doesn't call us to be all the same. He doesn't call us to be carbon copies. He doesn't even call us to be copies of him. He calls us to be more authentically ourselves and to recognize the human dignity in other people. And that should guide how we treat people, whether we've just met them, whether we know them very well, whether we work with them, whether we live near them, whether we are performing joint tasks together that rely on even more coordination. So it's a matter of dignity, not a matter of making everybody the same.
Yes, I appreciate that. Actually, in your essay on Solzhenitsyn, you said liberty and equality are not, or you quoted him as saying they're antithetical.
Sure.
Liberty and
Jesus
equality
discriminates in the Gospels. There are some people he gives jobs to and some people he doesn't.
Yes, right.
There are people who follow him more closely and he therefore gets to explain things in more detail to them. And there are people who don't follow him very closely. I mean, making those distinctions is not evil. Making those distinctions is not undignified. If you respect another person's free will, then you also have to respect that another person may not choose to be as heavily involved in something as you are. So you might have to make a distinction between people because of the things that they choose that aren't necessarily wrong, but that are simply different. You know, Jesus has 12 apostles, but he had 72 that he sent out to do some scouting for him. And he had thousands that perhaps followed along and took some of his things to heart. There were people who could only understand things in parables because they didn't spend as much time and effort in learning. There were people who could understand things much more deeply. So you're going to deal with people differently because people are different. As long as you're not dealing with them on what you said, the double standard of dignity and a double standard of violating people and imposing on them, then you're not venturing out into the kind of evil that unfortunately is systemic in a lot of our larger social circles and social structures.
So let's talk about this. The few things you said made me think about the theory of the state. So I think the states, I was raised as I guess my dad would be a trad cat. My parents were trad cats. They used to work for, and traditional conservatives, both. They used to work for William F. Buckley until they realized that he was a fraud. And so I consider myself, I was raised a traditional conservative or a classical liberal kind of, and then, which was libertarian. My father used to send $25. I'm the youngest of 9. They did not have a lot of extra money, but my father would send $25 every other year to Ron Paul's congressional campaign in Texas. This was in the 70s. He knew when I moved to Houston, and my sister said, "Oh, are you going to live in Ron Paul's district?" And I said, "Who?" And I was a very strong Ron Paul supporter by the end of my, first. As soon as she told me that, and then I was super strong supporter of his. But that's how I was raised, and so I'm a libertarian. I then went through anarcho-capitalism, but now that we're in this crazy post-libertarian thing where I mean, you could even think that the anarcho-capitalism, and I'm sure I know there's kind of evidence of that, you can move towards where it's just a setup to get rid of the nation state in favor of a world government. And so I try not to like put those labels on myself, but what I'm trying to tell you is that I completely understand the inherent contradiction in the state. But what
Sure.
the state is saying is that they have a monopoly on violence, whether they say it or not. The implication is that it has a moral foundation, that
Of course.
what they're doing is distinguishing between right and wrong and
Yep.
enforcing it. Now, of course,
Yep.
they do a total double standard because they're completely corrupt on the inside. But even just from a theoretical basis, like not as even a practical application, we are founded on the concept of separation of church and state. But so then what is the morality that informs the government? Like, what do you think should be, or do you think there should be no government like that? Because I'm not sure that's a strictly Catholic position, no government.
Well, I mean, not since the time of Constantine. All governments are religions. I wrote an article maybe a few months ago now about that. All governments are religions, but not all religions are governments. And I tell people quite often, coercive civil authority is inherently, intrinsically evil. If from a Christian standpoint, from even a humanist, nonviolent standpoint, from
Like
a consent-based standpoint. Yeah, a
Tolstoy
or a
spiritualist
Solzhenitsyn.
anarchist. Yeah.
Yeah, we already mentioned Solzhenitsyn. And I wonder if Rene Girard got there as well, mentioning him also. Ron Paul maybe got there. He was an accidental member of the government. He ran for Congress simply because it provided him a platform, and then he won. And his wife said to him, "You're going to have to go to Congress now."
Yeah,
oh,
yeah. It was an oppositional move. Like I would never hold that against him. Yeah,
sure. He lasted about 4 terms and said, "I'm done. I'm going back to being a doctor."
Well, I think he promised some kind of term limits on himself, so he left.
Yeah,
and
he did that, and then they sent him back years later and said, "You got to run again. You got to run again." And so he did it for the platform. I make a clear delineation because of course all governments are religions, which means all governments are based on some sort of morality. There's some sort of ethic and understanding of what good and evil are. For most everybody, because of psychology, order is good, chaos is evil. The known is good, unknown is evil. Controllable is good, uncontrollable is evil. So something becomes automatically good by default if it's orderly. That's just primitive psychology.
Can I tell you something?
And I don't think that's right at all. I think Jesus is good chaos. He's not order.
I've often made the point that I know there is objective truth because skyscrapers are plumb. That's truth. Like it's straightness is the accuracy of that is not arguable. And because of that, because like there's plumb and level and buildings that can, that's objective truth. No architect can be a subjectivist when it comes to drawing up plans. He can't be right and the other guy be right. There's a right, there's a way that the building will stand and a way that the building will not stand.
Laws of nature.
And it's good. Yes. And I think that's good. And I think it's good because of the order. So now you're saying, which is blowing my mind, that chaos, which is not the same as change, like the change of seasons is not chaotic. It's orderly change. It's orderly destruction. It's orderly creation. It's orderly change. But chaos, it's hard to embrace. It
is. But everything you care about in your life is the result of encountering chaos. Everything. If humans didn't encounter chaos and embrace it, humans would still be living in caves.
That is how we learn.
None of the innovations, and there'd be none of the innovations even socially. You'd still be doing that tribal thing where only the people you're related to are in group, everybody else is out group. And you would be encountering other people with fear and in violence. So the fact that peace is possible, that people live beyond the Dunbar number, that people of different ethnicities and lineages can meet each other and not be at each other's throats. All of this is the result of the embrace of chaos.
Yes, and that's how you You were talking about becoming a mature person versus a mature individual comes from an immature individual. I heard
Yep.
you talking about that.
Yep.
And how do you do that? And how do you become a unique mature individual? Because you wouldn't be unique if it was just mimicry. And
Yep.
it's how you interact with chaos. I can see that because experiences that I have already have don't impress me at all. Like I get into a
Okay.
routine around my house. It's only in something different happens. Somebody comes to the door who I don't know that I'm engaged. I don't remember what I did yesterday, but I do remember that some weird lady came by who didn't speak English. I didn't know what she was trying to tell me. Because it was different. And
Uh-huh.
so I grasp what you're saying.
I say that in the beginning of chapter 2. By the way, my book is it takes the 14 traditional stations of the cross. I add one to get to 15 at the end, and then I break it into 5 mini chapters, because if you understand them in the groups of 3, I think it makes it easier to remember and to reflect on the history that's going on. I open chapter 2, which I titled "Sharing." I say, when Jesus stumbles under the weight of the cross, a little bit of chaos crashes the strict orderly proceedings. Good chaos. Too often the human psyche reverts to primitive, closed-minded ethics. Order, the known or controlled, is good, and chaos, the unknown or uncontrolled, is evil. But Jesus often causes chaos for human order during his public ministry, presenting a fascinating complement to the Genesis accounts of God making order from chaos. Yes, chaos can be good, and order can be evil, as the Roman regime demonstrates quite clearly. Jesus is opposed by the control freaks. He's
Right.
opposed by the law and order types. He's composed by the hyper-rationalists.
Oh, yeah. Okay. This is what makes me think that
These are the people who oppose him. And they don't oppose him because he's a rival hyper-rationalist or a rival control freak or a rival law and order type. They oppose him because he undermines all of that, and they can't figure out what to do with him. So they resort to, when all you have is a hammer, everything's a
yeah,
nail, and they just kill him.
they don't have an answer. They
They don't
can't.
have an answer. They don't have even a framework for dealing with him. That's the passage where Jesus talks about new wine into old wineskins. The new wine is not going to fit into the old wineskins. What Jesus is trying to model for people is not going to fit into their social order, into their social structures, into their mindset that they've already developed, that's rather primitive and reinforced by your larger social structures, especially back then. But everybody starts out that way. We all start out worshiping, the ancient Mesopotamian god Marduk, who is the god of imposed order. He's the one who violently defeats the chaos monster in battle and makes the world out of chaos. And it's imposed order. It's not revealed order, like we may say in Christian circles. It's not spontaneous order, as you may say in anarcho-capitalist circles, talking about
Yes, yes,
large
absolutely.
markets. It's imposed order. So everybody starts out worshiping imposed order because that's easy. That's your primitive psychology. That's what I call the psychological path of least resistance, which I've written about as well. That's your path of least resistance. That's your starting point. You're not a mature person if you get stuck there. That's the
Stella
mimetic
says,
cycle. That's the old frameworks. That's your citizenship cycle. You're not really a mature person, especially not a mature individual, if you stay there and get stuck there. You have to grow. You have to mature. That's the call of Christ, is to mature beyond that way of viewing the world and its inhabitants.
Stella says Jesus is competition. That's why they don't like him. And
Absolutely.
yeah,
See,
I
competition is not a bad thing. He's competition not because he's going to do what they're going to do. He's competition because he has an alternative. He's an innovator, and he's good. And if he actually can draw people away from their way of thinking, that weakens their social order. So yes, he competes with them, but not on I'm going to play your game. He competes with them in a sense of I've got a new and better game.
and in that they have no answer to him.
No,
He's vetting the problems in their system. But I wanted
you
to
got it.
ask you, you are
Mhm,
making me think of this order imposed by the law and order types. It
mhm.
reminds me, I was around page 20, I think, but it's a thought I've had a lot, and something you wrote here reminded me of that. that the welfare state demands that you carry a cross that
Yep.
you are being forced to carry, and in my opinion, therefore, you get no grace for carrying it. It does nothing for that,
No.
it almost forestalls the possibility of you being Christ-like, and that's this outwardly imposed morality is empty of spiritual value, and it's a burden. You even resent it, which is the
Sure.
worst possible thing.
Of course, and that leads to really what you talked about earlier as, what's the morality of the state? I think it leads to a really twisted morality, but it's a very primitive morality that's easy to do. But you're absolutely right. As we understand virtue has to be deliberately chosen. It's not something that's
Right.
imposed. I wrote an article called Saint Joseph and the Virtue of Disobedience, because I have a problem with obedience being cast as a virtue, because it's really the anti-virtue. To outsource your ethics to someone else and say, I'm going to let someone else decide what's right to do, what's good and evil, and I will simply go along with what they say and do what I'm told. Well, that's an anti-virtue. None of the other virtues operate like that. None of them.
But this stuff is in, there are a lot of nuances, because when I have been to ever do that long form confession, it's quite annoying. I've probably missed confession for so many years that's why I had to do it twice.
An
But
examination of conscience?
yeah, the priest does it. So one of the things that I've read more than once, and the priest said to me was, the commandment, honor thy father and thy mother, also applies to respect for authority, being a good employee. Did you ever hear that?
Yeah, I've heard that before. Yes,
So
it's
you recognize a legitimate authority that you've kind of authorized and are committed to obeying. But I would
well,
have to say
I believe in the
you've
authority
all,
of
yeah,
personhood.
of what?
The authority of personhood. So we each have an authority over our own persons. That include, and that's where really natural human rights comes from: life, liberty, property. So we have an authority for using what we have and what we are capable of doing in ways that allow us to pursue what we aim for without violating other people. So there's an authority there. There's a nuance there, because there's more to authority than imposing, and there's more to authority
Yes, yes,
than there's more to authority than a
yes.
zero-sum game.
It's also responsibility. You cannot have a responsibility without authority. It goes both ways, because uh, if you have the authority, you are the one who's, it's almost like there's also another concept of the hierarchical concept in a family of a child. Like, why doesn't a child have total liberty in a household? Well, he's not really fully competent to have
Mhm.
the responsibility to have total liberty. So you do submit to a authority. Like we can just take the example of the family as
Mhm.
having a legitimate hierarchical authoritarian. You wouldn't argue that a child does not need to be obedient. Why does a child have to be obedient to his parents?
Well, you'd have to. Good parents will teach their children also to explore. So not everything is a matter of asking permission first.
Tell me about it.
You
I have walked that line and always gave my kids like too much rope, and man, teachers did not like it because they would ask questions and I had to make the decision, which way do I want to go with these kids? I'm glad I went the other way, but they were not very obedient children. That's true.
well, because you have to obey is to recognize that you should obey someone else. So the big thing I go through in the article is, okay, well, the virtue is in who or what you obey, not in the fact that you're obedient. So children
Yes.
obey their parents,
Legitimate
hopefully
authority.
because the
Yes.
parents set a good example and the parents are providing for the children.
Yes.
So it's who or what you're obeying. It's also, at some point you recognize when you reach the age of reason, oh, this is not really my house. I don't do a lot around here.
Yeah.
This is somebody else's house and I get to stay here very graciously.
Yeah, that's
But
a
I
good
don't
point.
do a
Those are
heck
the
of a
things that
lot
I
to
did
bring
teach
this
my
about,
kids. Yeah, I did teach
right?
those to my kids. And one of my kids said to me, he was just having all sorts of trouble and he was a little defiant and eventually came to me and he said, I came to a conclusion. He's very smart. He was a teenager and he's still a teenager. He came to me and he said, I came to a conclusion. You and dad love me. You have a lot of experience. You're smart. And I should just take your advice. I was like, good point. And he does. He takes my advice and it's good. Like
Oh,
he
well,
benefits from it. So I like your answer because it is the same answer I concluded and lived by. If they're like in imminent danger, you've got to, drag them back from the edge, but you also have to let them probe those limits while they're still under your purview so that you can be there to catch them or be there to advise them. So it is given it. I think there is, it isn't, I would say it is not, I never went for the strict obedience thing. And ultimately I think it did work out.
good. I mean, that's how you help people mature rather than keeping them little.
Yeah.
I
So
mean,
what is
that's
that? Yeah. You were talking
good.
about that with Gerard, with memetics, and are you saying he's wrong in saying that? Because the basic concept is, well, let's talk about that a little bit. It's the
Hmm.
memetics, it's the scapegoat, it's the victim god. So the
Hmm.
memetics, he says that you learn everything by mimicking. Mimetics, not memetics, because
Uh-huh.
memes also come in, but mime is what it comes from. So
Hmm.
he's saying that you learn everything from miming, and you say, no, you don't. You learn everything from uh, experience, basically.
Well, you don't learn everything one way.
Right. Modeling does matter, but
Modeling matters. Children act on emotion and imitation, which I think I said in the other conversation as well. That's pretty easy. I wrote about it very early in my Substack history, the curious gullible matrix. Um, children act on emotion and imitation. That's also why, for instance, in the Gospels, Jesus warns people especially about misleading children, because children are prone to that's just how they are. So that's why you take extra care with what you do around kids, because kids won't be able to parse everything that you do. Kids are more apt to be emotionally grasped by what's happening, and they're more likely to just take the plunge and do whatever it is they're witnessing. Try and copy it and see if that works. It's why you have to keep your kids away from electrical outlets, because
and
they see that things go into the electrical outlet and they're like, oh, I can just put my finger in the electrical outlet. No, you should. I can put this penny in the electrical outlet.
yeah,
And so you have to be careful what you do around kids, because that's how kids learn, especially early on. Now, as we get older, we develop reasonable capacities more. We develop the ability to reflect on things. We develop the ability to experiment and to observe the results of our experiment and learn that way. So there are all sorts of ways. Kids' reasoning skills aren't that sharp either.
that's
Of
Stella.
course,
Yeah.
that's the problem.
Brucey
Nobody
says
kept you from the outlets. Oh, how's your hair?
Brucey survived,
How's
though.
your hair
I feel
there?
like Brucey actually is like an electrician or something.
Right there, you go.
Are you now look at me. Are you an electrician, Brucey? I
Now,
really feel like
there
that's
you go. That's a funny aside there. I'll tell. I have friends through my parish who built their own house, and they wanted to get all their kids involved in building the house, and so they had to find something that their youngest could do. I think when she was maybe like 8 or so, and they finally decided that she could be taught how to do some of the wiring for the outlets. So there you go.
okie dokie.
He
Well,
was
I
old
will
enough to
say,
get the wiring right on some of the outlets, like
how
connecting the
old is
outlets
she?
there. I
How
think
old?
maybe around 8 or 9.
Yeah,
Like, they didn't want to give her
it's
too many tools. They couldn't maybe trust her to lift boards and do
yeah,
the big stuff. But like, you can rewire the outlets here.
that's funny. And actually think when you see what I call like the heirloom or legacy uh skills of knowledge, like how to handle guns, how to handle animals, how
Mhm.
to preserve food and stuff like that. You can, if kids grow up on a farm or whatever, they learn that stuff really young. I mean, you see kids who, yeah, I've heard stories, even in modern day, where a 12-year-old kills a guy who's breaking into the house and he knew what he was doing.
Yeah, right.
I feel like it's like a swimming pool. Like you have to, my kids could swim when they were 2. Like you have to, because I had a swimming pool and I couldn't sleep at night. And they can handle so much. If you push them, they will mature quickly, or learn those things quickly. You don't need to underestimate them. However, on the other hand, that's what makes it so sick what they do with kids on what kids see on screens, like deviant sex stuff and everything. Young kids, it will really cause mental problems in these kids to witness that kind of thing. And just if COVID didn't tell you we lived in a really evil society, the fact that when my kids were growing up, you could not actually, you probably still can't filter YouTube. It was either little kid stuff or free for all. And they wouldn't,
Oh,
third parties would make filters, but YouTube wouldn't let you use them.
oh,
Oh, yeah. So it's
Hmm.
really bad. And having a child who has Down syndrome, who's getting older, he's not engaged by the little kid stuff. But then I had to take his phone away from him completely. He can only watch, TV and stuff in the main room because it's just too damaging, that stuff.
Okay. Yeah,
Kids can't
a
handle it.
lot of modern technology is it's designed. I say that rationality is when you grasp your circumstances. Emotionality is when your circumstances grasp you. So
On that.
yeah, and we talk like that as well. We talk about people being overcome by emotion.
Yes.
We rarely talk, that people are overcome by reason. It's just not the way we phrase it. We're more apt
Right.
to say like, okay, I got a handle on that now, to talk about reason.
Overthinking.
So
I've been
we talk
accused of
about
overthinking.
grasping.
Yeah.
Overthinking can be, well, I mean, mimesis is and getting stuck in memes, which are very similar. Dawkins coined the term meme just because it sounded like gene, but he's talking about almost the same thing Gerard is. That it's those cultural replicators. Richard Dawkins, the famous evolutionary biologist, when he coined the term meme in 1976 in his book, The Selfish Gene, he wanted it because it sounded like gene, but it's from the same root as mimetic.
Okay.
So the idea is you're replicating something cultural that you see. It's recalling something. It's the same root in the term memory or remember. It's to make present again.
Like
and the way you make present again is you're kind of recalling something. So mimesis or memes is about something you've already seen that you're recalling. And if you start to embody that, that's sort of the mimetic cycle, where now I'm copying it. Go ahead.
Yeah. What's the danger you were talking about? Like memes are good for some things, but they're bad in some other ways.
Getting stuck. All memes are garbage if you stay at the level of memes.
So give me an example of a meme.
Government. I just do what I'm told. I'm a good citizen. Every great atrocity in the history of human civilization was brought about by people who did what they were told. Everyone. Pathological believers are much bigger problem than pathological liars.
Yeah, because one person alone cannot do that much damage. They have to have people helping them.
Sure, and the person at the beginning of it may not even be lying, in the sense that they may not be deliberately telling a falsehood. They might simply be mistaken. But if everybody just copies the mistake, you've got a problem. So the danger in memes is, I drew the analogy back to biology. It's like Dawkins gave us the wonderful extended metaphor of genes to memes, of biological replicators to cultural replicators. Okay, let's take that extended metaphor and go with it. You don't get mature humans from mature humans. You get mature humans from immature humans. You get immature humans from very immature humans, all the way down to the gamete level, when two complementary gametes connect. And now you've got that new thing, and that thing has to grow. If it stays at the gamete level, it's just it's reproductive trash. Gametes that don't actually meet are trash in the reproductive cycle. Okay, memes that you don't grow out of or use to grow deeper and sharper, they become harmful. They're intellectual trash. Mimetic cycles are harmful because getting stuck at the meme level of anything is immature. It's primitive. It's worse than childish, because the good child is at least being curious because the child wants to grow. But being just stuck in immaturity, that's being stuck in no growth. And now we've got a bunch of people walking around, they're just overgrown 10-year-olds.
It's also weaponized. I was reading a really long slideshow.
Sure.
It was like 130 pages. It was an inside government thing.
Okay.
And I think it was called like mimetic warfare or something. And one of the slides was how they use memes to enhance dysfunctional subcultures. I remember that phrase completely, enhance dysfunctional subcultures. And I saw it, they act like, they always write those things as if it's a foreign country, which, by the way, they have absolutely no right of doing that to a foreign country either. These are human beings who have the same rights as we have. But I since then, so I noticed that probably 10 years ago. Since then, I've seen them do it here. I've seen them use, I mean, you've got like this cohort of the 18 to 24-year-old male or whatever, who, I mean, I know the memes you're talking about are bigger, but the actual, like, you know, square memes that say something on them, or the way social media will redirect or exploit the you know, the commonalities in that age group or demographic, that it just leads them. Like, you can see how the reaction to the wokeness is now, I mean, you can go so far as to find like Hitler revisionism, and you know what I'm saying? And of course the history, Renee Wormser of the Reese Committee in the Congress actually wrote after World War II, I think, a book called The Myth of the Good and Bad Nation. So I'm not saying that all the World War II propaganda is correct. I'm not saying that, but rehabilitating Hitler is something that I never would have seen 15 years ago. And I saw it emerge by directing people to react to wokeness. You know what I'm saying? So those to me, that's was a kind of mimetic warfare that enhanced a dysfunctional subculture, actually created a dysfunctional subculture. We did not have that 15 years ago. Zero, none. Oh, maybe not zero, but close.
Memes aren't new. And governments using memes aren't new either. The first article I wrote about this general topic was titled Ancient Memes and Modern Lawfare. So maybe the tools are modern.
Yeah.
But the memes predate, memes in some ways predate civilization. Like, civilizations form mimetically. Like, they don't predate humans.
Can you unpack that for me? Because I can usually catch stuff pretty quick, but I don't get that.
Sure. I mean, the fact
predate civilization. Explain.
Sure. People copy each other. People learn from each other simply by imitating. That happens before large groups of people get together. That happens before cross-tribal populations emerge, which is really what a civilization is. Memes are how everybody starts. Animals almost do memes. When you train your pet,
now I get it. Yeah,
you're almost trying to get them to do something mimetically. Yeah. I mean, mimetics are ancient. Mimetics are dull and shallow. That's why I warn people about them. It's, you know, on the axis of thinking from dull to sharp, memes tend to be dull, and on the axis of thinking from shallow to deep, memes tend to be shallow. I mean, the occasional one will be a little sharper than dull and not shallow, and therefore it might be funny. You know, that's the sweet spot for comedians. You want to be sharp but shallow. You want to give people just enough for the punchline to make sense. That's where marketing happens as well. You want to give people enough information, just enough. It's shallow, but you want to be a little bit sharp so that your tagline makes sense. Yeah, I'll give you a joke. You brought up Hitler. The man who killed Hitler must be the greatest man in history. If you know your history,
Cute.
you know why it's a joke. Hitler committed
I go a little
suicide.
deeper than that because I don't know who
Hitler
killed
committed
Hitler.
suicide.
Did he?
So well, but that's the
That's what they
history
say.
of it.
No, I
So
get your
like,
joke, and I love it,
yeah,
but
that's the
yes,
joke. So,
see,
but
stuff like that just fails. Like, once the scales are pulled from your eyes, like, it really ruins a
sure,
lot of stuff. Then your comedy has to be super edgy, which is no longer allowed.
right. It has to be. You have to keep going for new things that where the reference will make sense. Because again, you don't
Yes.
want to have to do a joke set up for 5 minutes
Yes.
to get to a little
My
punchline. You
my
want the
uncle was
setup to
a
be quick.
my uncle was a priest, and he, is irrelevant, but he was just a thoughtful person, a very well-educated guy, and he said the essence of humor is in the surprise. So you all have to have the same expectation to laugh at the same joke because the surprise has to be the same. And I always thought that that was true. And he said that's why Catholics have the best sense of humor because they are very clear in their expectations. They have a very like
Oh,
what's the
okay.
right and wrong. And which I do think Catholics do have a good sense of humor. It could be the drinking, I don't know. But I generally I think it's that. But also it made me realize why foreigners, so most of the time foreigners don't really speak the same language. You think maybe it's language barrier, but if you like Canadians and Americans, there's plenty of overlap, but it's not strict like in English too. Sometimes we just don't get their humor.
Yep.
And I think it's because we just don't have the same baseline expectations.
Yeah, you
And
have to get the reference.
that's why once the scales are off your eyes, you're like, yeah, your jokes are dumb because you're stupid. because
Well,
because you don't because your expectations are wrong. Those aren't my expectations. You're not surprising me by telling me that Hitler didn't kill himself, you know?
sure,
So
and
yes,
it's the shallowness of memes. If
yes,
everybody stays at the shallow
yeah.
level, then everybody can get the same jokes.
But that's the place to start digging, I've heard you say.
Yes, yes. I mean,
Like George Carlin, you should pull on those threads.
you should pull on the threads. You should dig. The meme is good if it marks a spot on the treasure map where something is buried, and if you make the effort, you can get there. You can you can dig. You can start looking. Is there something sharper to do under there? Is there something deeper? Is there something worth pursuing? But you don't get that if you're comfortable with the dull, shallow meme level. And societies are built on the dull, shallow meme level. It's the lowest common denominator. It's the path of psychological least resistance. It's the primitive psychology that everybody has. Even people who've outgrown it still have that. But not everybody has outgrown it. So, Girard brings up the point that he thinks that all civilizations start with what he calls a founding murder.
Yes, talk about this. What the
Okay,
heck? You guys are making jokes, you and Scott and William, because you all have this common understanding of what that is. I struggle to understand. I mean, I know what a
sure,
scapegoat is, God, and I want you to tell me how Jesus fits in at the end.
sure. Let's do scapegoats. Maybe those are easiest because that's
But
the
what's the
that's
founding murder? The founding
okay.
murder.
The,
What
the
is that?
founding murder is the idea that civilizations begin when somebody is brutally killed and people sort of coalesce around that murder. I'm going to bring it back to in-group, out-group, and I didn't go through this in very detail with Scott and William, but the Dunbar number, small tribes, they exist by clearly defining the in-group first in substantive terms. It's people you see every day, interact with. It's people who are closely related to you. So you define your in-group. Then you define your out-group as a derivative of the in-group. Okay, anybody who's not in the in-group is part of the out-group. And then you can get into the question of, well, do you treat people drastically differently in-group, out-group? But at least the Dunbar tribal way of doing things is you define your in-group and then you define your out-group off of the in-group. When you get to bigger groups of people, populations that no longer share a tribal connection, it's no longer possible to define the in-group. So how do these civilizations come together? Well, the Girard theory is that they coalesce around just picking out some common enemy. And then everybody who joins in ganging up on the common enemy now becomes part of the de facto in-group.
Oh
When
my
you
gosh.
can no longer define the in-group first and then get your out-group from it, you then descend into defining an enemy first and then forming an in-group
That
as everybody who comes together to have the common enemy. So that's why
that is
there's a
happening
founding murder.
right now. That is happening right. It's not necessarily the founding murder, but and I think this is a
Governments do it
big
all the time. They always
but
need
there
an enemy. You can't keep people together unless there's an enemy. You can't
but
keep political parties together unless there's an enemy. So
but
you
the
define an
Israel
enemy first, a
think
fearful
about the
enemy, and then the
Israel yeah.
in-group forms in opposition to the fearful enemy. That's the Girard theory of how civilization starts, because
But
it can't start tribally. It has to start the opposite of that.
okay, maybe I'm wrong, but it just seems to me that uh the what Israel's doing in Gaza, it's invading Lebanon right now, it's bombing
Mhm.
Yemen, the poorest country on earth. So were we. We're bombing Syria.
Sure.
So all of that is being used. I've noticed, you probably haven't noticed this, to take it a step further, bring it to a general anti-Semitism. And it's not. I'm Syrian, so I'm a Semite. So I'm not going to say
Yes.
anti-Semitism, but like anti-Jewish rhetoric as a generalization against the entire group of like subgroup of Americans
Mhm.
or all Jews in the world, whatever. And then if you don't conflate those two things, you're considered in the out group. It seems like to me right now, like
Sure.
you wouldn't necessarily. I don't know if you've noticed that's happening right now.
I've noticed a little bit of I'm being an outlier and really outside of the Overton window in popular culture. Um, a lot of these things aren't
Yeah, yeah, they don't
surprising to
affect
me
you.
or
Yeah,
very new, So and you probably see some of that as well. But yes, I've noticed that the the civilization always needs new outgroups to attack, because that's how the in group forms. The in group doesn't form
yeah,
first. The
right.
enemy is
Interesting.
identified first, and then you figure out who's with you and who's against you by who joins in ganging up on
Yes.
that enemy you've defined.
Well, that
So it's
one,
the reverse. That's the founding
yeah,
murder. Civil
that
tribes start substantively because people are related to each other and live in proximity. Larger populations, which we call civilizations, can't start that way. They start by coalescing around a common enemy, even if that common enemy makes no sense at all as to why you ganged up on this innocent person and just pretended that they were, a demon.
that one I was talking about, that one is definitely going to backfire, in my opinion. I think it's a setup, but you see that with politics, which with the fact
Sure.
that, but it's not. Well, it is founding, like it with Trump, like to me, his foundational uh actually, if you want to talk about a literal murder, and I think it was a psyop, whether somebody died or not, was this Kate Steinle murder in San Francisco, which basically launched Trump's campaign. But I consider Trump to have eh, his e- and actually maybe every political campaign these days is about who you all hate.
Sure.
You
That's
all
why
hate
attack
this
ads are
person.
popular.
Yeah.
Look at the Rescuing the Republic rally that took place recently. It was the idea behind the Rescue Republic rally was that
Mhm.
people from all different perspectives and backgrounds would come together simply because they all hate either the deep state or they have a common enemy, which is the censorship complex, which is against the freedom of expression. So, what brings those people together? If it's not the founding murder, it's the prospect of having a founding murder. Like, oh, we can defeat censorship if we all come together.
Well, the founding murder thing also, maybe not in ancient times, maybe in ancient, probably just as well. What it does is you have to stick together in order to not be charged with the murder. So I was listening to a woman who said
Yeah,
as a
you don't
child,
want to become part of the outgroup, especially
yeah,
since it's irrational.
and you all
You
have to
have
be
no
especially
idea why they picked out that victim. You have no idea if he's guilty. You just know that everybody else thinks he's guilty. Everybody just knows that everybody else thinks that person is terrible. So everybody else believes that person is terrible. but nobody else knows how you got there. And so you fear, oh, is that going to happen to me? So I better virtue signal to people.
Yeah.
Like virtue signaling is older than virtue.
Yeah.
In a sense, because of what we do metaphorically to the terms.
Chimps murder and lie.
Yes, and they're extremely tribal and they have imposed hierarchical social orders. Chimps have what is essentially a modern government. They just don't have the modern tools. They don't wear suits and give themselves fancy titles with the language. But it's absolutely, every government is a chimpanzee social order. Every single one. They're extremely tribal. They go to war. They do all sorts of things that keep together the imposed hierarchy. It's primitive psychology. And I don't mean primitive as in, oh, it's like 100 years ago. No, I mean it's pre-human evolutionarily psychology. It's primitive psychology. Order, good, chaos, evil. Known good, unknown evil. Controllable good, uncontrollable evil.
It's constant. Like it's still all the time. COVID had tons of that.
Yes.
Where you just ganging up on somebody.
Yes.
You wouldn't, the mask thing, even
Yes.
the people who would get insane that you weren't wearing a mask wouldn't actually necessarily argue that it was a health thing.
No.
It was a social thing. It was you were danger to society. It was really nuts. So did they need something like that? Do you think that our psychology, our cultural, our sociology, that we are still so unevolved, as it were, so primitive that they need to keep giving us that? And
Yes.
in that same vein, is Jesus on the cross like just a way to, like the Eucharist even, which I don't want to implicate, but is this just a way to keep our bloodlust at bay? Still?
Jesus'
Is it an
model
ongoing blood sacrifice?
Jesus's model throughout his ministry is against that. But to the first thing where I answered yes to, yes, if your society is based on imposed order, then anybody not complying is a threat to the order. You're a threat to society
right.
if you won't join with what society is putting forth. If your society is based on compliance, then the non-compliant is a threat to society. But if your society is based on dignity, then people who have different ideas aren't a threat to that. If your relationships are based on simply respecting natural human rights and letting people pursue what they're interested in, then your society is not threatened by non-compliance. If your relationships are based on consent, then the only thing you're threatened by really is violations of consent. You're not threatened by differences. But if your society is based on enforced similarities, then yes, your society is threatened by someone not wearing the mask.
So, but there are so many non-compliant now. Do you think that that's a sign of this civilization, this coercive civilization, consent-based civilization is not going to make it?
No, I don't think it's a sign that it's not going to make it. I think it's a sign of something that Gerard brought up, which is that mimetic rivalry takes place not only within people copying the same thing, but also people with competing things to copy. I think it's going to be memes versus memes. I think the people who are non-compliant, Trumpers are non-compliant with woke. Wokers are non-compliant with the Trumpist MAGA stuff, but they're all extremely mimetic within their groups.
Right.
So basically, it's just it's which one is going to succeed in turning the other into the minority outgroup, whose conquering can then be turned into a mandate for governance.
Oh my gosh, so true.
Right? All of this stuff is ancient. It just has modern phrasing.
But it just seems like there are too many people on the minority side. There's just too many numbers. I mean, I guess technology, the technocratic tyranny it has to be all powerful. That must be why they're pushing for a captured AI. Like I just think there are too many of us. I think the minority, I think it's going to be where the majority is non-compliant.
Well, what's your population level? You brought up being against the global government. Imagine how just absolutely violent and impositional a global government would have to be, because there's 8 billion people you have to force into compliance. Maybe we're talking about scale. I mean, has the United States grown at 330 million people to the point where it's becoming more and more difficult to force compliance on that number of people, which is why the government has to become more intrusive.
Yeah.
Which is why not only the size has to increase, but the scope has to increase. Because you can force one person to do something pretty easily if you have the weapons advantage. But at some point, it becomes tougher to force 5 people to do it, 10 people, 100 people, 150. It becomes really difficult to force 5,000 to do it. How about 50,000? How about 500,000? How about 1 million? How about 100 million? How about 330 million? The implements you have to wield in order to force that many people into compliance, it just doesn't work. And you know how you get that kind of compliance at that
propaganda?
Well, by outsourcing it to the population.
Yes,
which
they
is why
it's
the person wearing the mask who yells at you for not wearing the mask.
100%.
Not a government official. It's someone who,
you're right, 100%.
It's the pathological believer who is so worshipful of what's going on that they willingly become enforcers. It's citizen's arrest.
Yeah.
You don't have to call the cop. It's citizen's arrest. So that's why mimesis is so powerful if people get stuck at that low level of thinking. Because now you're not only the person who's obedient, you're the person you're now the watchdog making sure that other people are obedient. Because you now have a stake in the obedience. When you have a stake in understanding deeply what's going on, you will not behave that way to people. But if your stake is only in compliance, then you will become the person who looks to make sure that compliance is happening. If that's the level you're operating at, you now have a stake in maintaining it. That's mimesis. The government has been using meme warfare a lot longer than computers have been going around. Yeah. Have you ever said the Pledge of Allegiance? That's meme warfare.
Not lately.
Not lately either. That's meme warfare. That's meme warfare. It was written by a socialist, by the way. And it was written to sell flags because this socialist, weirdly, in some cognitive dissonance thing, worked for a flag manufacturer. So the Pledge of Allegiance was written as meme warfare by a confused socialist operating in a market where his employer wanted to sell more flags. Now it's just used for compliance. Meme warfare is old. It's older than civilizations.
And you co-opt people once they start arguing, once they start harassing you, even they're much less vulnerable to learning that they're wrong.
Sure, I attack people's premises and arguments all the time.
Yeah,
I refuse
they don't like
to accept people's premises.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
I go right after the premise, because once you accept somebody's premise, and especially if the premise is just insane and nonsense, once you accept their framework and you're going to work within their framework, now you're just arguing crazy versus crazy.
Yeah, it's called
once you accept the government framework of coercive civil authority being a moral imperative and monopoly violence institutions having a moral mandate, having an ethical mandate. Once you accept that framework and you argue within that framework, you're arguing nonsense versus nonsense. It's like in 2016 when Trump won the election over Hillary Clinton as his primary challenger. First of all, funny story. That was the last time I voted in an election. I voted for Gary Johnson. And then as soon as the election was over, I spent 2 weeks absolutely berating every Hillary Clinton voter I could find for costing Gary Johnson the election.
That's great.
But then you saw at Trump's inauguration, you saw all these protests. And I heard people saying, well, you don't like government. They're protesting government. Why don't you join them in protesting Trump here? They're protesting government. And I responded, those people are not protesting government. Those people worship government. They're throwing a fit because in their minds, a disfavored person became high priest. I went right after the premise. I do that all the time because almost all the time I'm faced with nonsense premises. I'm faced with weak premises. And if you're going to start attacking the premises and go deep on things, you're going to realize how much is based on such a shallow understanding. And these imposed structures are based on shallow understandings of things. They pretend to be deep because they have pageantry and titles and all sorts of ranks and privileges associated with those ranks. But it's terribly shallow. It's a terribly shallow view of human beings. It's not a deep view of human beings. You've got to go deep to get to human dignity. You've got to go deep to get to an understanding of dignity versus price, where dignity is an innate worth that a person has, whereas price is a value assigned from the outside. Human beings don't have price, I don't think. Although some of the things we do can have a price. You can trade your labor. But human dignity is an innate worth. It's not assigned to you. The price of your labor, the price of my book, the price of ads on your streaming platform, the price of any product or service you would sell, those are assigned values, and there's nothing wrong with that. But a human being is deeper than price, because a human being is deeper than the property level. And so if you're going to have a deep view of humans, you're going to have to cast off a lot of the stupid premises upon which a lot of popular arguments are based.
So just getting back to a couple of things, what do you happen to know what the church's teaching is on government, on anarchy? Because my aunt, who is a real Catholic,
depends on what portion of the church you're going for.
Well, I would
church
say
is
canon
2,000
law.
years old.
I would say canon law.
Okay. Well, again,
because my aunt said you got to watch with anarchy. Jesus was not an anarchist.
Yes, he was, but he was more than that. My very first Substack article I wrote goes through this. Anarchists get a bad rap because anarchy tells you what to oppose, but not what to do. So Jesus was an anarchist, but there was substance behind it. So he was more than an anarchist, right? He wasn't simply a bad citizen; he was a good neighbor.
Right.
So and frankly, Christianity gets the same bad rap because the thing people are most familiar with are the 10 Commandments, which are full of stuff not to do. So anytime you get told what not to do, if you're a deep person, you're going to question, okay, but what do I do? What do I do? I understand what I'm supposed to be against, but what am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to be for? So in that sense, anarchy is incomplete. Anarchy is not antichrist, but it is incomplete because it's only a statement of negation, not a statement of position. To be a fuller following Christian, you do have to know what to do. You have to have some positions, not only some negations. But I think Jesus is quite obviously negating the imposed hierarchical social orders of his time, whether they be Israelite or Roman, in the areas where he lived. I think that's quite clear. Where in church history do you go? Pre-Constantine or Constantine? Because Constantine completely changes the incentive structure of Christianity. People like to say Constantine Christianized the Roman Empire. I think that's wrong. I think Constantine and his cronies within the magisterium paganized the church.
Interesting.
I think they completely changed the incentive structure. It used to be that to identify as a Christian and to actually practice as a Christian meant that you gave up status in the larger social order. You couldn't serve in any sort of government position where you were violating people and actually be a Christian. The early church wouldn't let you do that. You couldn't be a soldier in the army, in the Roman Empire army. You had to make a choice. The early church made you make a choice. You gave up status to be a Christian. And becoming a Christian did not gain you any sort of impositional rule over other people. Constantine completely changes the incentive structure. Now all you have to do is identify as a Christian and you get extra status. Now you get to impose on other people. You're not only against impositions, you're the one doing the imposing. Constantine and his cronies in the magisterium, I'm talking to you, Eusebius of Caesarea. Constantine and his cronies, they completely changed the incentive structure. In the second station of the cross, Jesus takes his cross. I reflect on that. I say, but as Christianity during and after the reign of Roman Emperor Constantine, which is early 4th century AD, became politically acceptable, the notion of carrying one's cross becomes distorted. After all, so-called Christians now occupy prominent positions within the hierarchical social order. So-called Christians share in the exercise of coercive civil authority. So-called Christians can violently impose the cross on others. What great progress for so-called Christian citizenship. What great loss for true Christian neighborliness. So you tell me what portion of church history you're aiming for, and I'll tell you whether anarchy is acceptable or not.
I wasn't talking about history. I was talking about canon law. I was talking about
remember, canon law is 2,000 years of building.
Well, what do you think the church is based on? Like, do you recognize canon law?
I recognize apostolic tradition, not necessarily church tradition.
Okay.
Because church tradition includes Pope John XII, who turned the Vatican into a brothel.
But that's not in canon law, right? Like, I'm not talking about tradition. I'm talking about like matters of faith and morals, canon law.
It may have been canon law back then. Canon law is emergent.
Right.
But
there is a status right now of canon. Like, you can get today's copy.
You can get today's copy of canon law. There are parts of it that if they are too friendly of governments, I would say that canon law is not quite keeping with apostolic tradition. I mean,
look, I think Pope Francis drinks baby's blood, so I've got a real, it bums me out. I'm a practicing Catholic, and I think I don't know if there's anything redeemable in the Vatican at all. It's like it sucks to have that kind of conflict, but I don't really read canon law. I just assumed that in matters of faith and morals and stuff like that, it's actually probably it's the law. I don't know.
Look at the just war theory.
I don't know where to draw that line.
Christians used to be against war. Canon law used to be against war.
And it isn't anymore?
Then canon law was in favor of war. Holy wars, the Holy Roman Empire, the divine right of kings and queens. Suddenly it's holy wars. We recently celebrated a feast day in the Catholic Church, Our Lady of the Rosary, which began as Our Lady of Victory because one side in a war prayed for victory and they got it, and so they established the feast day.
Yeah.
Probably forgetting the fact that the people on the other side were probably praying too.
Yeah.
So then canon law is in favor of war. And now canon law is trying to hedge their bets since we're in a post-Christendom age where Christianity is not so completely and thoroughly tied to these, I think, satanic institutions of government. So now we have canon law as well, the just war theory, which is as long as a legitimate authority has exhausted other possibilities and has declared war, then the war can be just. So again,
it also has to be proportional. There has to be a chance of winning. They have to have a just cause.
Chance of winning. Yeah, there's all sorts of stuff in there. But look how canon law on war has changed.
Yes. Yeah, no, I get it.
I blame Constantine. I blame, but I have to say, I have to watch myself there because again, Constantine is just a stand-in for that period of history and what happened. Pathological believers are worse than pathological liars. I blame more so the people in the magisterium who said, yeah, we'll go along with that and let's start apologizing for the Roman Empire. Let's start doing that. Let's start creating motifs for the Trinity that actually cast the Roman Empire in Trinitarian terms. Like the Roman Empire is now God the Father, and it makes the world
Well,
safe for God the
yeah,
Son, which is
that's
the
a
church. Like
so
that's
that's what
pretty early in the Constantinian era when that kind of basically blasphemy of what had been early
right.
church understanding of their mission and their connection to the transcendent, it becomes used as fodder to prop up the regime. So I hold to apostolic tradition, not necessarily church tradition, because church tradition includes a lot of stuff that did not keep with apostolic tradition. Now, fortunately, the sacraments are apostolic tradition. So
Yes,
I'm
yes.
a fully
That's what I'm there
believing.
for.
I'm a fully
Yeah.
believing in
Yes.
what sacrament is.
Yes.
Early church Christian. So, like, I don't attend mass for the wisdom of the clergy. First of all,
Right.
there's not always an indication that such a thing
Yeah.
exists.
I wish they had the canned sermons.
I
Why
attend
rewrite them every year? Like, just there's got to be a right one. Didn't they used to have
I
canned
attend for
sermons?
the sacrament. So if the sermon is lousy, that's not why I'm there.
Right, right, right. No, I
You know,
agree totally. I'm there for the sacraments.
I
Absolutely,
understand
100%.
what
There's
sacrament
nothing more to
is
it.
as a connection to the transcendent and an opening of yourself to that, and as an understanding that if the transcendent is truly part of this world, then there's nothing wrong with having a physical sign of it. There's nothing wrong of having a physical instance of it. We believe Jesus is a physical instance of the fullness of the divine. We
So
believe that
what?
each of our souls is, in that sense, sacrament, an instance of the divine. And we believe that Jesus left us practices that help us make that manifest, that there's a real presence involved in sacrament.
So what do you think is the the I don't want to say the meaning of Jesus, but the meaning of Jesus in the context of the founding murder, of the scapegoat, of the human sacrifice, of the blood sacrifice? I mean, it seems like I gathered from listening to you and Scott and William that there was this primal need there, the scapegoat, the blood sacrifice, the human
Yep,
sacrifice, and
yep.
Jesus came to liberate us from that by taking all. So the scapegoat is take the sins and kill the goat. He took all the sins, so we didn't have to do that anymore. Is that, I mean, is that what we're reliving every Sunday? Is that, or every time we go to mass, or what, how does that play into the Girard thing?
Um, Jesus is, I won't speak too much of Girard because I read about his anthropological studies, but I don't know about his faith. He
No, but
seems to be
I'm
Christian.
saying symbolically, like if he says you needed a founding murder, you need scapegoats, you need blood sacrifice, you need human sacrifice. I'm asking you, to the extent you understand those archetypes,
Mhm.
do you think Jesus fulfills some of that primal stuff for us? His death
Um,
and the Eucharist. And the fact that he died for our sins, which is very scapegoaty. The
I
traditional
think
scapegoat was that you put all the sins onto the goat and then slaughter it.
actually there were two. There was the scapegoat
Okay.
and the sacrificial goat. The
Got it.
scapegoat was
Yes,
the one.
yes, yes, I was just
The
reading that.
scapegoat, the term "scape." We
Yeah,
use the word "escape."
right,
So the scapegoat was the one you put all your sins on it, and then you sent it out of your city.
right,
And
exactly.
so the goat that had all your sins escaped with all of your
Oh,
sins.
interesting, great, yeah.
So you put all your sins on this thing, and then
Oh,
you
so
cast that
Jesus
thing
wasn't
away.
the scapegoat, but then why would he take on all the sins and be the sacrificial lamb?
Um,
Is that too
Jesus,
tricky?
no, it's not too tricky. It's
Okay,
just
good,
not. It's just not a quick answer.
good, great,
But I'm an
fantastic.
over talker, so
That's
um,
fine, go for it. Take your time.
Jesus does not purchase salvation for us because that turns God into a pagan god who demands a ransom and holds people captive,
Yeah.
and that turns Jesus into a pagan sacrifice. So Jesus does not purchase our salvation for us on the cross. Jesus is killed because people are evil and they kill him. The miracle of the cross, the mystery of the cross, is that Jesus, who could have done evil to them in return to get out of it, refused to do so. Jesus would not escalate the violence. Cities are founded by escalating violence. Civilizations are founded by escalating violence. You gang up on some outgroup. You define the outgroup. It goes back to your very first question, in-group, outgroup. You gang up on the outgroup. You commit an act of violence. For a while, that act of violence brings a false peace, because it's not really peace. It's simply a complacency temporarily, because people have all ganged up on the same person. And now that thing is done, people can maybe breathe a sigh of relief. But then they keep needing victims. They keep needing to repeat the violence. So the old mimetic cycle of the founding murder, it keeps needing more murders, because you almost have to keep refounding the civilization anew, because there's constantly new people in it.
Interesting.
Even if it's the same lineages, it's new people get born, old people die. Maybe there are some people who venture into it. So it keeps needing new victims. Because you're never actually facing up to it. There's two general directions you can go when you realize you've done something wrong. Either you can make an excuse for it and kind of cast it away, or you could take responsibility for it. The scapegoat method is to not take responsibility for it. The whole scapegoat thing is you can keep doing whatever it is you want to do and just get together every now and then, cast your sins onto the goat, and send the goat away. You don't actually have to change your behavior.
That's what people say about
You just have to go get another goat and put your sins onto the goat and then kick it out of the city.
Yeah.
You don't have to change your behavior. You just have to find another lamb to sacrifice. You don't actually have to take responsibility for anything you're doing.
All right. So that's the difference between that and confession. People always say that is what confession is, but it's not.
Confession is trying to, first of all, admit your faults and trying to change. So there are penitential things.
It's committing to change. It's committing.
Yes, whether it's sacramental confession or even other penitential changes that you take place in your life outside of a formal sacrament. If you're trying to take responsibility for what you're doing, then you're going to try to change. You're going to try to improve. You're going to try to grow and mature and develop. That's the difference between insourcing your conscience and outsourcing your conscience.
Shame. Yeah,
I talk about that
guilt.
right in the beginning. That's what it means to develop your conscience, is to insource things. Good neighbors insource their ethics. Charity and friendship are the key virtues of their relationships. Good citizens outsource their ethics. Compliance with the commands of rulers and enforcers is a fundamental, necessary aspect. Some might call it a civic virtue. Good neighbors consent. Good citizens conform. If you want to develop your conscience, you have to insource your ethics. You can't keep having these founding murders where you don't take responsibility for things, where you victimize people unjustly. Jesus redeems us on the cross because that's God refusing to escalate violence. That's God refusing to take on our mimetic cycle that is, it's satanic. It's destructive. It can't escape itself. It can't even be a real good scapegoat and actually escape. Because the people who put their sins on the goat, they don't actually get to escape. The goat does. The people are still trapped there. So the cross is liberating because of what Jesus refuses to do on the cross. People tell him, if you're God, come down from that cross. Jesus won't do it. The cross is liberating because Jesus refuses to do what people want him to do. Jesus refuses to be the God that people want. Jesus is the God that is true to what the holy transcendent is. The cross is liberating because it gives you an example and a real concrete chance to outgrow the nonsense that surrounds you.
So can we just talk a little bit? I know we're starting to get up on 90 minutes, but I do, if you have a couple of minutes, I'm interested. Okay, good. I'm interested in your thoughts about what appears to me to be a hijacking of Christianity, of Catholicism, of the hierarchy of those institutions by people in our culture and politics. Like, it makes me uncomfortable that J.D. Vance converted to Catholicism, Candace Owen. Like, I feel like, or when you see Russell Brand and Jordan Peterson and a known agnostic saying the Our Father at, in a place where they're charging money and stuff like that, just seems, do you have any thoughts on that stuff? Do you see where it's going and fears?
Cultural Christianity is not something I participate in much, because there's Christianity becomes a metaphor for dominant Western. I have no problem with people converting to Catholicism if it's sort of the first fruits of a real faith.
Of course.
Or converting to Christianity if it's the first fruits of that. But one of the reasons why I think Constantine's quote unquote conversion was a scam is that he didn't stop being emperor. He kept doing all the things he wanted to do as emperor, violating people. And in fact, he turns it against the church. Roman emperors start getting involved in church debates and violently putting down the side of the debate that they disagree with.
Right.
So Constantine didn't really convert to Christianity because he wouldn't stop being emperor. People in government who convert to Christianity, I hope that what they're converting to takes hold in them and they grow in their faith. One of the problems, and you mentioned the church being hijacked, is hierarchy and social order, social structures are very, very attractive to a certain personality type, to the people who are very high orderliness, conscientiousness. And I think the church has something to attract all personality types, but I think that what the church should offer you when you get there is a way to correct your pathologies. And the church does that with a lot of other pathologies, but it doesn't do that with the orderliness pathology. In fact, it celebrates the orderliness pathology. And it celebrates it to the extent of celebrating the imposed orderliness pathology.
I have definitely seen that. Yeah.
Since the time of Constantine.
The most apparently devout people, I think, do that. And it actually folds in with pride.
Because their devoutness is orderliness.
Yeah. And
what they're really worshiping is the order, not Christ. Yeah. They're not worshiping the transcendence. They're worshiping the order.
I agree with that.
They're worshiping the hyper-rationalism of it. They're not worshiping the order, and on the other hand, I have some empathy and sympathy for, say, someone like Jordan Peterson, who sees a lot of Christian culture and is very wary of hyper-rationalism and is therefore squeamish about calling himself a full Christian, because what he sees of Christianity is hyper-rational. He hasn't yet seen the real transcendent, where he's attracted to that.
I understand what you're saying.
What he's seen is the hyper-rationalism, and he rightly is averse to that. Now, that doesn't mean that he hasn't slipped into his own orderliness. For years, he lived and was a professor in Canada under a very imposed socialist order. And he was perfectly fine to have the high status of that until something happened that turned him against that, and he lost his status. But then he found status somewhere else, so yeah. So it's a dance you do between, are you really rejecting imposed hierarchical social order as a category, or are you only rejecting the specific instance of it that you disagree with right now? Like, are you actually rejecting the circus, or do you just want different clowns?
Mm-hmm, yeah, definitely.
There's a lot of people.
That's the problem with Trump versus Ron Paul. Trump's just saying, I'll be there. I'll get you what they're getting them. And Ron Paul says, just get your own.
Yeah. And you have to parse that for people, because sometimes people don't even parse the difference themselves. They're against the current clowns, and so they make believe that they're revolting against the circus. No, they're not. They just want different clowns. I don't want different clowns. I want to get out of the circus. I want to not go to the circus. I want to undermine the circus. I want the circus to be a lot smaller so that it's not as big an obstacle for me. I don't want different clowns. I'm against the circus, not just against the clowns. So, that's why I'm an anarchist, because I'm against the category of imposed hierarchical social order, no matter who's doing it. I'm not just against this one instance of it or this one official who's exercising it. I'm against the category of monopoly violence institution. I'm against the category of coercive civil authority. I'm against the category of might makes right. I'm not simply against certain people who do it, or certain targets that they have, or certain ways they have of implementing it. I'm against the category. I disagree with the premise.
So when you look at the future for the next generation, or your kids or grandkids, what do you fear the most, and what gives you the most hope?
For myself, I full disclosure, I don't have any kids. But I'm an honorary
you can
uncle.
put yourself in that, yeah. And
Sure, I'm an honorary uncle to
yeah.
friends, kids. My
Yeah, I
little
mean, but
friend.
you understand the problem, like
Sure.
humanity, the future of humanity in the near term is what the point I was making.
Government will never go away because it's the psychological path of least resistance. So there will always be people doing it, and there will always be people drawn to it. There will always be people drawn to evil from a Christian sense, because you benefit from evil. That's why people do it. Or at least you perceive a benefit. You perceive that you will benefit. You perceive there's a benefit to violence. You perceive there's a benefit to systemic violence. You perceive there's a benefit to it. So this isn't going away. I mean, the personality types of seeking imposed order, that's not going away. That's a big five personality type. Everybody has a little bit of it. So it's not going away. Memes are not going away because dull, shallow, imitative behavior is not going away. All children do it, and it takes work to outgrow that. Not everybody outgrows it. So none of this stuff is going away. The question is, will you become an instance of growth and development in your life? And will you then model that and encourage other people to do that? Will you spread memes, not to spread memes in and of themselves, but will you give people little things to think about? This is what Jesus does with parables. Will you give people little things to think about that promote growth rather than promote satisfaction with the meme level? You have to outgrow this stuff. The call of Christianity is to outgrow your primitive psychology. The call of Christianity is to outgrow the founding murder of civilization. The call of Christianity is to outgrow in-group, out-group, where the out-group can be violated, where the out-group is not recognized to have dignity. The call of Christianity is to outgrow any sort of social justification where you get to pass off responsibility onto the system or the officials or the structure, the government, the hierarchy, whatever, and treat people with less than dignity and treat yourself with less than dignity. The call of Christianity is to outgrow that, because if you outgrow that, there's a wonderful substance waiting for you. There's a wonderful substance of the transcendence, that your soul is a glimpse of that. And, grace is God sharing God's life in your life. It's that little glimpse of the transcendence, and we all get a little bit of that. Faith is your answering of that call. It's your acknowledgement that this exists. And I think even agnostics and atheists recognize something that can be called transcendence. They just give it different names. I think Dawkins, an atheist, recognized the transcendence, and that's what brought him to his instantiation of the selfish gene in meme culture, because he was trying to give language to the things that we see all around us that are clearly real, but they don't follow strict material biological coding.
And this is your proof of God? Is this what you like? Your faith is not weak, right?
God for me is
you feel
the wholly
strongly,
transcendent. My
right?
God for
And
me
you
is the
can
wholly
see it
transcendent.
in your life, like you feel like you are
I
seeing it. It's not a
experience it
rational
and I
thing.
can
Yeah.
see it.
Okay.
I
Right.
experience and I can see it in other people, and I see it as something that's truly God, in the sense that it's my highest value. I worship it. To worship is to make something a high enough value in your life that you will order other values according to it, and you may even sacrifice for it. So that's worship. And yes, people worship government, and people have worshiped government since governments have existed. That's why I say all governments are religions, because people do actually worship it.
Oh,
And
yes.
surprise, most of the people in your church pews on Sundays worship it. Most of your clergy worship it, all the way up to the top. Most of them take this as an
Yeah.
extremely high value.
Yeah.
They order
Yeah.
their other values under it, and they will sacrifice for it.
Dude, you
So
wouldn't
most
believe it
people
when
worship a lot of different gods because they're trying to find that confluence of the gods. I stopped worshiping all that other stuff that involves imposed order and violence and anything that's anti-dignity. I cast aside that. I undermine it. I'm an anarchist for that. I'm strictly a voluntarist for that. I'm a genuine early church Christian for that, as I understand the Gospels. But then I strive for the more substance, because I think the transcendence is a substance. It's not just a lack of something else. It's, good is not merely the absence of evil. Evil is not merely the absence of good. I think they're both substances. I think they're both something that's real. I think evil is not simply a metaphor. It's not simply figurative language. I think evil is a real thing. It's a real way that people formulate the world based on a real psychological substance. And it's a real thing that people pursue because they perceive an advantage to it. I think it's real. And at the same time, I think goodness is more than simply escaping that. I think goodness is a substance. I think love is a substance, and dignity is a substance. I think that when we treat people according to dignity, according to them having an innate worth, this is why I'm not merely a transcendentalist, but also a theist, because I believe that the good things of holy transcendence are those things that we recognize as personhood, as personality: love, will, deliberation, encouragement, seeking the good of the other as other, dignity, and innate worth. I think these are personhood characteristics, not merely ideas. So I'm not simply someone who recognizes the transcendent as even an atheist could, but I'm a theist. Further into that, I don't believe that it's my role to project my aspects of humanity onto the quote unquote divine, like many of the ancient polytheists did. They created their gods in their image. I believe that if the transcendent, as I experience it, is real, then it's the transcendent that's trying to create something in me. So that's the Judeo-Christian notion that was put in language before people understood it, to be created in the image and likeness of God. That's what it means. It means that
that's the
we're
first
no
page of the
longer
Baltimore Catechism.
right. You're no longer creating the gods in your image, creating the transcendent in your image. You're allowing yourself to explore the transcendent, knowing that it may change you. So in that sense, I'm in the Judeo-Christian line. I'm also a monotheist because I think the transcendence works to a unity, not to a fragmentation where the collection of gods in Mount Olympus are rivals with each other. I don't believe there's, and this happens in the church sometimes. People say, if we had more justice, we wouldn't need charity. And I think that's such a terrible bastardization of what virtue is. Charity and justice don't oppose each other.
Very
They
good.
work. All virtues work together if they're actually
Yeah.
virtues. All virtues harmonize if they're actually virtues. So because I believe that these personhood aspects of transcendence harmonize ultimately, I'm a monotheist. And because I believe that Jesus Christ fully reveals this in his life, in his ministry, as we have it recorded to us, I am a Christian. So I take it from a maybe a different starting point than old time religions, where you start with the social order. And that's what you worship because it provides your structure. And then you order everything off of that. And if you create gods with your imagination, they all fit into that framework. And then you look to find your place in that order. I don't do that. I do the opposite. I have a glimpse of the transcendence. And the more I pursued that, the more I had to cast off the things that opposed it, like imposed hierarchical social orders. So I went from my journey was one way, and then it dipped, and then it started in a completely different fashion. And so when you ask me about people who convert to Christianity, if something in that conversion,
I'm not talking about converting Christianity. I'm talking about prominent people who are obviously whatever. I'm talking about something very specific there.
If converting to Catholicism gives them a glimpse of something that gets them on that journey to change, then of course I'm all for people trying it.
I agree.
I teach OCIA. I teach people who are curious about it.
Yeah.
The Order of Christian Initiation for Adults in the Catholic Church. I used to coordinate it for 2 parishes. Now I'm a volunteer teacher. I do Sunday sessions and sometimes Tuesday sessions. My parish has an outreach ministry to a nearby university. So I teach within that ministry as well. Yeah.
So tell us about your other work. Talk about we're going to wrap. So why don't you tell people about your Substack, your other podcast, which is nothing to do with Catholicism, which I think is funny, and see where they can get the formats of your book, all the ways people can support you and learn more about what you have to say.
Sure. Good Neighbor, Bad Citizen is available at Amazon, at Barnes & Noble, and at Lulu. Amazon has both the paperback and the Kindle edition. Barnes & Noble has a paperback and a Nook edition. Lulu has the paperback. So whichever platform you enjoy. The paperbacks are all on-demand publishing. I don't have paper. I have this one. This is my author copy that I got to review.
I love the paper. I'm going to get a paper edition of that because I want to take it with me and, cheat when I'm saying the Stations of the Cross.
Sure. Reflect. And you can, and it starts on one page and it ends on the facing page. There you go. So you have that. The paperback is all on-demand publishing. When you order it, the platform from which you order it will print your copy of the book and send it right to you. It's the least amount of transportation miles and fuel miles and packing materials that we can do. So if you're into conserving resources, on-demand publishing is a pretty neat
but you also have
development.
A Substack.
I have a Substack where I write weekly on the same themes of Good Neighbor, Bad Citizen. It's got the same name. Search for Good Neighbor, Bad Citizen on Substack, where I go through some topic each week. Each article I file is less than 1,000 words, so it'll take you less than 5 minutes to read. I'm not going to take up your whole morning or your whole evening or whenever you're reading it. I respect your time. And I do have a background from writing in newspapers where, space limitations were real.
Yeah.
So you had to get to the point and you had to wrap it up.
Yeah, your book is excellent in that regard. Really food for thought. It's not a big volume, but you could definitely.
It's an hour's read. You could use it as a meditative aid and actually walk the Stations of the Cross with it.
You could really reflect. And I really enjoyed, I loved your conversation with Scott and William. I'll put it in the show notes at monicaperezshow.com. I really like.
They kept me more than 2 hours, so I'll spend as much time as you want.
Yeah. So, but also, what is your podcast about wrestling? This is the first
I'm on a pro wrestling podcast called "Don't Bury the Lead," a wrestling channel. It's got a journalism sense there and a wrestling sense there as well, as like burying people. But it's called "Don't Bury the Lead" because when my friend, who I knew through an indie wrestling promotion, he was a wrestler, I was the commentator. He said to me, "I want to do a wrestling podcast, but where we recap wrestling shows and do stuff. But I don't want it to be like those other wrestling podcasts where like they take forever to get to the main event. Like I'm going to do the main event first."
Fair enough.
I said to him, "All right, so you want to not bury the lead, and like maybe that's what you call it. Don't bury the lead." And his like eyes get wide.
Perfect.
We're sitting at a diner talking about this. He's going, "Yeah."
Is this on iTunes? Where can people find
It's
that?
we live stream on Twitter, Twitch, and YouTube. The archive of the show is on YouTube. My buddy runs the whole thing.
Perfect.
He
And
will
what and
edit videos.
don't bury the
and
lead on YouTube.
Don't bury the lead on YouTube. You can also find it on Twitch or Twitter when the live streams happen, usually Saturday evenings. But yeah, I do that. It's a pro wrestling thing.
The lead is
It's
LED. LEDE is how you spell lead.
LEAD. Yes, we spell it that way. We don't.
Oh.
Yeah, the newspaper people wanted to be funny and sometimes spell it LEDE.
Yeah, I thought that's what it
but
was.
But it's the lead. It's the beginning of it. It's the thing
right.
that
Yeah, it's weird that they
spell
it like that. And what's your Twitter account handle?
I am at Good Nay Bad Sit because they only give you 15 characters on Twitter, and Good Neighbor Bad Citizen is more than 15. So I had to shorten everything to the first syllable. It's Good NEIGH Bad CIT. Good Nay Bad Sit.
All right. With that, I will say goodbye. Don't you go away, Domenic. Thank you so much for coming, for listening. We have just concluded a very interesting conversation with Domenic Scarcella, but you can also find his work on Substack. He's got the podcast on YouTube. I'll put all of the places you can find him, and especially a link to Good Neighbor, Bad Citizen, the book, which I think is very worthwhile. I'll put all that on my show notes on monicaperezshow.com.